you so much for joining us today. It is Wednesday, July 15th, 2020, and we are still right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We are still, receiving all of the awakenings that the culture at large is bringing into awareness around the protests and anti-Black racism specifically, and just structural inequities in general societally. And Natasha and I thought that today, what would be a good thing for us to talk about is how those structural inequities play out within the therapeutic container, within the structural academic setting, within the actual analytic training institutes and PhD programs and whatnot. So Natasha, here we go for yet another edition of Inside Out. So glad to see you.
Hi, Francesca. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we're going to talk a lot today about what it's like to train to become a therapist and how much white supremacy and whiteness informs the practice and training of psychotherapy itself, even though the people who are involved in becoming therapists and training therapists and also consuming therapy are themselves often Black and brown people.
Right. Yeah, the title for today is Beyond Inclusion, How Psychotherapy Training Recreates White Supremacy and What to Do About It. So, Inside Out is really a show for therapists by therapists, specifically for white therapists mainly, but really anybody obviously can watch and join and listen. So we're really trying to sort of dig in at different levels. And some of the previous conversations we've had have been about what do you do in the clinical setting, but this is also like, what do you need to think about institutionally, or if you've created a model and you are offering that particular model, like for example, I'm trained in somatic experiencing, what is it within that model that you can do to de-center whiteness and recontextualize the way in which the model itself is operating, not only in terms of content, in terms of what's being offered, not only in terms of to whom is the model accessible or not accessible, but also within the training itself. How does it marginalize certain folks more or not? And what are the ways to rectify that? So I'll let you sort of take it from here, Natasha, because this is something that you've been thinking a lot about for a long time and have a lot of direct experience in. So I'll follow your lead on this.
Okay. Well, so one thing I wanted to talk about in the beginning here is the different ways that people get trained as therapists. And Francesca, you should jump in and just sort of add anything based on your own experience. But there are many different ways of becoming a therapist. And depending on who's listening today, we may have mental health counselors here, we may have social workers here, we may have clinical psychologists here, we may have people who come in as pastoral counselors. There are many other people who are psychoanalysts, licensed arts therapists or clinical arts therapists, people who are psychiatric nurse practitioners, people who are psychiatrists. Like there are many, many different paths to becoming a psychotherapy practitioner, in addition to being like a mindfulness practitioner or I don't know, anything that comes to mind, Francesca.
Like a yoga teacher, for example, or yoga trainings or, things along those lines. There's a lot of bioenergetic kind of trainings. There's a lot of like the Reiki, the craniosacral, like all these other different kinds of ways of sort of moving and orienting toward more integration, coherence, and well-being. But that within all of these models, if they're constructed within a Western psychotherapeutic framework, even though many of them draw on, as somatic experiencing does, shamanistic or, more holistic and more equitable practices, when it comes time to actually structure and implement and teach the model, the way in which it's taught is often with a violent or oppressive lens that they're not even able to recognize because it's so much a part of the imperialistic, sort of manner of individualism that is part of the problem.
Right, absolutely. And even in what I was saying, there was a little bit of that because I was thinking of psychotherapy practitioners as people who are licensed. So even the process of licensure itself, which separates out people who are, for example, who can be reimbursed by insurance, which is a big way that people afford and get access to psychotherapy, is somewhat separate from this sort of larger pool of ways that you can get trained in a healing modality, which includes things like everything from, body work, Reiki, acupuncture, to somatic experiencing, really like an incredibly, indigenous focusing training, coherence therapy. There's so many different things that you can get trained in
Sure.
that will be separate from the way that you're licensed.
Right, right. And some of those, I know some, to be a licensed massage therapist is something you have to go through
Yeah.
too. But that
Yeah.
specifically what we're talking about primarily, because what you're saying is cooked into that, there are ethical mandates, there are obligatory mandates around not doing harm, just like there are for the Hippocratic Oath with medical doctors like my mother.
Yeah.
There are ways in which that one would practice, if you are practicing by your ethical licensure codes, would require that you be aware of and astute to also internalized racial superiority mindset within the model training and practice, and the implementation of the construction of what those models and licensure protocols are, in order for you to then be the practitioner you're purporting to be through adhering to these ethical statements that, if only taken in a white lens, aren't going to hit the mark all the time.
Right. And I guess like one aspect of this is that licensing itself, I think originally was considered a way to create accountability for people's behavior in, people who have a certain amount of authority to provide something that's considered like a healing modality, whether it's like physical or mental health or, dentistry or, massage. And yet it also is used as a way to exclude, regulate, and exploit people, either just financially to get the license or to kind of just make it harder for certain groups to, or just more marginalized people to get access to the license. And then because licensing is so much of a part of how people can become part of these sort of larger structures where, you get access to money and payment through insurance or being able to work at a hospital, or, there's a lot of ways that licensing and the whole structure around like who gets to practice what is both, can create accountability, but also exclude and marginalize people.
So let's start with an example. Let's start with the this morning, and Brian can give you access to this. Our fearless producer, Brian Wesley Johnson from Celebrity Live, he'll put, hopefully a link to this. But there were a couple of articles that I was sort of reading this morning about this very issue. A very well-established, well-esteemed Black psychiatrist, Black medically trained, psychiatrically trained woman, psychiatrist, wrote an article about how she's sort of, quitting regular, institutionalized psychotherapy because of the myriad of microaggressions, the myriad of ways in which she's tried to do institutional and structural changes that have not been adhered to. A lot of lip service and a lot of continuation. And structural racism is why I am leaving organized psychiatry. And that article really kind of pointed to the fact that within the training itself, and even after you are licensed and you're a professional, there's all kinds of problems. So do we want to start there for the people? Okay, let's start there. Talk about that from your white clinician's perspective, but knowing what you know, from knowing what you know.
Well, one thing that's really interesting to me about this article in this particular moment is that she's talking about psychiatry, which is the medical field, right? So these are people who are medical doctors. So this is really, when you're talking about mental health and psychotherapy, this is really the top of the food chain in many of these kind of hierarchical systems of mental health. Like these are people who they get paid the most. They do pay the most for their training, like it usually people come out of medical school with $200,000 of debt, $250,000 of debt. So they're under tremendous pressure to make money. And a lot of people who don't come from inherited wealth will go and work in the public sector as a way to get student loan forgiveness. So there's a lot of psychiatrists who are working in public health, both because they believe in the mandate of public health and wanting to serve underserved and marginalized populations, and also because they need help paying their student loans back. So I guess where I would start with this is that when you are when you are yourself from a marginalized group and you go to work in these environments where you're both within a very white supremacist field, which is, or a very white, like a field that is both created by and sustains institutionalized racism, which the medical field and the psychiatry field certainly do, historically and currently. You're both like sort of stepping into a position of power, but you're also stepping into a system where you're marginalized by virtue of your identity. And that's true for anyone who isn't a white male from an upper class background or an upper middle class background, highly educated background. So it's an alienating environment, and it's also a very shame-based learning environment. Medical school is, the medical field, for the most part, education is very much a shame-based, there's very much a shame-based learning model.
Talk about that, shame-based learning model. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a phrase that I learned when I was working in the Bellevue, which is a public hospital in New York. I was working in the psychiatric emergency room in my training, and I came from a clinical psychology program, which compared to medical school is very supportive. They really sort of care about how their trainees feel. They care about the students. They're really trying to make sure that you're okay. You're, learning all this like very difficult material. And going to work in an emergency room, which is really a medical environment, is really shocking as a psychology trainee, because they're very abusive to their trainees. Not abusive in the way that you might be hazed in the military, but there is a decent amount of hazing in medical school training. So when you're a psychology trainee in a medical environment, you're training alongside medical residents and medical students, and the way they get trained is much more hostile and much more confrontational than it is in psychology programs and probably most mental health training programs. So for example, being called out to, you're called on to present a person who's come into the emergency room. You're told like, okay, you need to present to the attending physician. You need to give all this information. You have to work really quickly. You have to answer a lot of questions. And if you don't know the answer, you'll pretty much be called out as like not knowing what you're talking about, and be sort of shamed and blamed for not being good enough.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
And the point of that is to really kind of force you to get better at what you're doing quickly, so that you don't have to experience that shame and blame. And it's sort of like a behavioral model. Like you're going to try to avoid the aversive punishment by getting better, by learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how does that play out differently for white clinicians in training versus Black clinicians?
Well, there actually were no Black trainees when I was at Bellevue, and there were no Black doctors either. But I think I would assume that and I don't know for sure how it would be in that particular hospital, but I think in general, because there were quite a few doctors who were people of color, but there was a lot of ethnic similarity between the people of color who were doctors and trainees. So there was probably more affiliation rather than, kind of discrimination and prejudice. But I think we can just assume that there's going to be more hostility, and there's going to be a more sort of racial hostility that will then get masked as this kind of like shaming and blaming that everybody is getting.
Right. Yeah, my mom's an ER doc, and please, I've heard the stories for decades. As a woman, back in the 50s, it was hell to sort of enter that world. So I hear a few different things. I hear, one, there are institutional equity wealth gap, that there are inherited wealth gaps for marginalized populations and dominant populations. I use these terms not because they're my preferred terms, but I could say Black versus white. I could say people who have not been centered and who are, have been, the subject of systemic years of oppression versus, those who have, asserted their dominance over others. But for the purposes of shorthand, please know, I'm just using these words and these terms for the purposes of conversation. But for those folks who have been marginalized for a long time, there isn't always that inherited wealth that you would have. And so part of the gap is I'm not going to go to medical school, or I'm not going to go to get a PhD because I don't have the money,
Right.
right?
I can't afford it. I can't
Right.
afford to stop working. I can't afford to stop having income.
Right. Part of it might be nobody in my family has done that. Like I don't have like a lineage there. I mean, a lot of people do, right? Like I actually, went to school with a lot of folks who are Black doctors whose parents were Black doctors, and they're. So I'm not saying this is monolithic again, but I'm just saying that oftentimes that isn't something where you're just like, oh yeah, everybody in my family was already a doctor, a lawyer, a banker, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, right? Like and so there's that in terms of also the modeling. But say you do all of that, say you find a way, you have good mentors, you have your own resources, however it is, you go to school, you go into a training program. Then when you're there, you talk about like what this woman has experienced when she's in her psychiatric practices and institutions and elected as board leader and member and all of that. He had the article up before. I forget her name now, but I could find it in a minute. But the point is that that it still wasn't supportive. It still wasn't supportive. So there's the pre-barrier, and then there's the training problems in terms of shame and blame, so to speak, which are kind of just systems of oppression in general. That's white body supremacy in action anyway, somewhat in service to being able to turn on a dime in an ER. Ruth Shim. Okay, Ruth Shim is her name. Dr. Ruth S. Shim. Dr. Ruth S. Shim is the author of the article. Thank you, Brian. And then there's also, everything that happens afterwards. And I just want to give because she pointed this out, Dr. Shim, a definition of institutional racism from the Aspen Institute, in case anybody's like, what are we really talking about? Institutional racism refers to the policies and practices within and across institutions that intentionally or not, and this is important, produce outcomes that chronically favor or put a racial group at a disadvantage. Poignant examples of institutional racism can be found in school disciplinary policies, in which students of color are punished at much higher rates than their white counterparts, in the criminal justice system, and within many employment sectors in which day-to-day operations, as well as hiring and firing practices, can significantly disadvantage workers of color. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to talk a little bit more about the Bellevue situation, which is not to call out Bellevue in any particular as a particularly bad example. It's probably actually good compared to a lot of other places, in the larger picture, because it is a public institution. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that for Dr. Shim, or someone like Dr. Shim, all I'm talking about right now is just the sort of base level, sort of probably more unintentional hostility that exists in the medical environment that she was coming up in. But I don't think that that was the part that she found particularly
egregious,
exclusionary. Yeah, like she got through all that and she rose up very high in her profession. And yet I think what she was getting at, as much as anything else, besides the sort of like slow grind of microaggressions and macroaggressions, was this sense that the system that she was working in was never going to serve people like her and people that she wanted, that she had gone into the field to serve. And that no matter how much she asked nicely, forcefully, she put it coded language, not coded language, like the system itself was not responsive in a sort of very fundamental way to the needs of people who are by definition marginalized by this white supremacist system.
Is that elitist?
Is what elitist? Or
is that because of elitism?
Oh, because of elitism? I think I guess like my thinking, I think psychiatry is one of the toughest in terms of undoing the white supremacist sort of underpinnings, because the idea of a mental state or a psychic state needing to being a medical problem is by definition kind of pathologizing, especially when you're mostly working with tools like medication. like the medical model around psychic states is inherently oppressive, I think. And so it is hard to use it as a tool to serve, to kind of mitigate the distress caused by institutional oppression, you know? But that's not to say that people can't be helped. I think it's just hard to feel like the system itself is helpful. And that's why I think she's sort of coming to a place of abolition versus reform, because I think she's someone who was within this system trying to reform it for a long time and just came to the conclusion that it wasn't possible.
So what would abolition look like?
Well, it's interesting because within psychiatry, there is a whole movement that's mostly led by sort of people who identify as psychiatric survivors, or people who are users of the psychiatric symptoms, people who have been in psychiatric institutions or have diagnoses of quote unquote mental illness. And those folks tend to the extent, like it's a very broad movement, but I think in general, the idea is like, we want community-based care. We want care that's really led by our own needs. Like we want to be a stakeholder. We want a bigger seat at the table. We don't want to simply be treated as, patients that need to be told what to do. And, if we don't, then we're considered non-compliant. Like the ask is for a more equitable form of care.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if we look at the actual statistics, you'll see that a lot of Black Americans are diagnosed with things like schizophrenia compared to white, or, that there are certain diagnoses like reactive attachment disorder or something, and, that there's just that the degree to which inherited, they say racism is a pre-existing condition. And so to the degree to which that manifests in these psychiatric, diagnoses that are sort of, pathologized, it's like, well, does the abolition help us get to the root cause of the pre-existing condition of racism, whereas the reform does not?
Right. And having worked in quite a few more psychiatric settings, I think there is a huge difference in terms of how people get better based on the kind of system or container that they're in, and how restrictive, punitive, and pathologizing it is. Because the less people are treated as if there's something wrong with them, and the more they're given sort of like tools to, to be an autonomous partner and participant in their own healing, the easier it is to do that. And a lot of the sort of systems that we have, which mirror mass incarceration in many ways for Black and Brown people who are economically, disadvantaged, the cure is as bad as the disease.
Got it.
Or the cure is the disease. You know what I mean? Like the cure of going into a psychiatric hospital to get better for your psychotic episode is actually just going to make you worse, or it'll make you temporarily better, but it'll be better in a way that isn't sustainable. Like you're going to be taking medications that will take 10 years off your lifespan.
Right. And that gets back to the structural issues just at large. And I'm going to read another definition from the Aspen Institute about systemic racism. And it says, in many ways, systemic racism and structural racism are the same thing. They're synonymous. If there's a difference, it can be said to exist in the fact that structural racism analysis pays more attention to the historical, cultural, and social psychological aspects of our currently racialized society. And, the structural pieces, public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, other norms at work in various often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And I think that's really the whole piece it's this equity piece. They say that racism is power plus prejudice. So it's this power piece. It's this equity piece. It's why we talk about inherited wealth, and not just are you working or do you have a job or whatever, but what are you already receiving? And in the terms of white skin privilege or white racially advantage, you're receiving something you may not even recognize as a thing, and yet gives you access and sort of a lubricant when you enter these fields, if you will, right?
Right. And yes, and licensing is is a conduit to a kind of power that you need if you want to make a living as a mental health practitioner, or that's what many people assume. Now, I think there are actually many people who have managed to make a living doing things that are outside the structure of, state licensing. However, I think often those people have some kind of resource, economic resource that they're able to rely on until they get their it's sort of like a form of entrepreneurship.
Sure.
So like the training model is more like you're an apprentice, but the problem with the apprenticeship system that we have now for mental health practitioners is that it relies on a tremendous amount of debt.
Right.
And you have to take on a lot of debt, which then sort of forces you into needing to make a lot of money by going into a more sort of conventional system of practicing like an evidence-based model in order to, get a job, working at a hospital or working, like you're going to have to make money when you get out of school. And in order to do that, you're going to have to go work in some kind of system, state system, local system, private practice system, in which you're going to have to do something that's going to be very inherently kind of part of this, kind of these like, empirical with models, which are, meaning like the imperialist type models. Whereas if you want to work completely outside that system, you're going to have you're going to need to have some kind of the financial wherewithal to start your own business.
Yeah. I mean, I've done both, right? So, and I've had a lot of privilege and inheritance around certain things, including financials and, to let me do both. I'm not, a 1%er by any means. And yet at the same time, I have an enormous amount of social capital and actual, financial capital compared to other to some other folks, and I get that, what I mean.
Right.
I absolutely get that, and I'm also kind of a hard scrabbling worker type person that kind of puts things together.
Right, you have to hustle.
Right, like so there's that. This is never an indictment of meritocracy, working hard, or actually disciplining yourself. This is always just that isn't always enough when these structural issues of racism, just as whatever
Right.
with melanin is a factor, which is just a construct. I want to go back to me just to say that now I'm a licensed psychotherapist, but I practiced as a sort of entrepreneur, as you were saying, for a while, and it takes a lot to kind of get that off the ground. I want to go back to this idea that a lot of the folks that we're sort of trying to gear this show toward and for are pretty much like white social workers, white mental health counselors, white therapists, psychologists, a lot who see white clients perhaps and don't bring up race or don't know how to, or now are having the feels, but are kind of like, what do I do? Or they maybe don't see Black clients, but they could, but they don't know how to because they haven't done their own work. Or, how do the institutions that are training us, like I just got out of Fordham, what do they need to do differently in order to have this be more fluid? And more something that everybody can not be a barrier to care.
Well, right. And I think that it is important to kind of work on solutions as well as just pointing out the problems. And I think the difficult thing about these larger institutions who are the gatekeepers for, I guess what I would call the more kind of conventional or kind of like socially legitimized forms of delivering mental health care, which would be social work, mental health counselors, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists. Those institutions are big money-making machines that don't really want to rock the boat too much and really need to continue to bring in students. And on one hand, they know that they need to bring in students of color, both because it looks bad if they don't, and also because they need bodies in the classroom. And so there is this tension between wanting to kind of like keep things running smoothly, and the more you admit people who are either BIPOC people or non-BIPOC people who want more to come out in after spending all this money and time and training, want to be more fluid and fluent in talking about racial inequity, institutionalized racism, white supremacy. There is a need to kind of make things more uncomfortable, which kind of like, then I think there's a tension around like, well, how do we keep this going and keep the money flowing and do something that kind of is very destabilizing and uncomfortable? And
what if you can't? And what if you do it anyway? Because it's the moral thing to do.
Well, I mean, and I think that's great. It's just that convincing administrators to do that is very difficult. I mean, I've had experiences going to administrators and explaining to them exactly what we're talking about and getting a response of, well, it's too bad that we're also very speciesist, and we don't talk about the needs of animals. Like I literally got that response. So there's a lot of resistance there. And so I think even though this is incredibly urgent, and I think the urgency is building in many, many programs, and a lot of programs which have avoided this topic or avoided talking about racism or really done the bare minimum are now facing real uprisings from their students because people are no longer willing to just accept that they're going to go through school and only talk about racism and structural racism and white supremacy in a sort of, one semester class that is really not very well run or not very well done. Or and on top of that, people, BIPOC students really want to feel safe and they don't. That's another big problem.
Well, I guess there's a couple of different things that I want to pull apart here. One is that if you're a white therapist and you do care about what we're talking about and you want to change, what do you do? Either institutionally or personally. If you are a person of color who's trying to go through school and be a Black therapist or, then what are you going to encounter and what do you do? Right. And then there's the from the institutional, place and from a learning place, but then there's the clinical space of the clients. What do you do and how do you act with white clients versus with Black clients, say, for example? And I just read a book called African Americans and Jungian Psychology by a woman named Fanny Brewster. And it was fascinating because she's trained as a Jungian analyst, and she's talking about how there's no Black, pretty much Jungian analysts within the analytic training that she had. And also that the way in which Jung set up his whole model of, psychoanalytic, looking at clients was, of course, from his European-centered, colonized lens, and would use, in the terminology around shadow, the darkness, the privilege, because all these interpretations about dreams and things, right? And what's primitive and things like that. And that her beef wasn't so much that he was a man of the times, but more along the lines of the analytic institution hasn't come up to speed with actually then interrogating the way in which the language that's currently used to describe what he was pointing to, perhaps, and the errors in which he may have been making big assumptions based on one case with one African-American man or something as a sort of, global thing. But that happens, right? I mean, like these things do happen. That the institutions, the analytic institutions, haven't taken it upon themselves to interrogate the whiteness inherent within the model and update it to a more equitable way of teaching and inclusivity to get to the heart of what I think analysis and any therapeutic work is really about: wholeness and about, connection. And it's almost like a spiritual or an existential sense of feeling all right. I think that's what we're all pointing to and aiming to. But when the system itself is so broken. So can you talk a little bit about things like that? Because I think it's a good example of how it's currently being taught with complete blinders on.
Right. And what I was thinking as you were talking is that, what is the name of the writer?
Fanny Brewster, Brewster. Brian put up the book now.
Okay, good. Thank you. So she's a good example of someone who essentially has taken what was sort of presented or what is there, and reinterpreted it and reshaped it for her own needs, and as a representative of a group of people who are not served and yet can draw some value or some utility from this theory or model, but for whom the model is not created and ultimately falls short, even though, and I think this is like generally how people who are not white men of privilege, who've had the space and the time and the resources to create these models, and white women of privilege, because there have been many women involved in psychology and at least psychology and social work and the psychotherapeutic models. People have taken the structures that existed and refashioned them in a way that has been useful. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like how clinical work historically has been done, like outside of the sort of more scientific model, is like there's like a whole tradition of clinical wisdom being passed down and kind of modified, and people try this and try that and then write about it or talk about it through supervision or just sharing with each other what works and what doesn't. And so there is a way in which doing the work sort of DIY style and just creating alternative structures that then can, this kind of thing done by people who do not feel really well represented or included in the sort of larger sort of superstructure, which is like the power-based superstructure, is sort of how it's been done and how it continues to be done. And maybe that is the model. I mean, that's sort of, again, an abolitionist model. Like, we're just going to like create our own thing, and we're going to try to get rid of, either by attrition or by kind of like pushing, kind of overthrowing a system that really does not work and isn't built to serve us. And right. So I guess my question is, when we have these conversations about what to do about these institutions, I'm really divided, because on one hand, I feel like it feels futile in many ways to try to push directly back against these systems, which generally, no matter how hard individuals try or groups of individuals try to kind of like work within the systems to change them, are just, these systems often are, and if we're talking about a large hospital system, if we're talking about a university system, if we're talking even about smaller institutions like psychoanalytic institutes, which themselves are not terribly well funded or resourced anymore, but still resist change from newer, younger, members who are people of color. Like, there's something about the resistance that drains the energy so much from people who are passionate about kind of creating more equitable systems, that I think it is sort of, it does lead me to think like maybe the goal really needs to be just focusing our energy on creating alternative networks and alternative strategies for serving people, for doing the work that we're interested in doing, because engaging institutions is a real drain. On the other hand, institutions have real power, they have real capital. And if you're talking about going through a psychotherapy training process, they're going to take a lot of your money and saddle you with a lot of debt. So the idea that you're going to come out of it without what you want is extremely frustrating.
So is it that we demand more? Because I mean, I was on a call Monday night with one of the analytic training institutions here in Manhattan, and they were sort of doing the mea culpa dance around, we need to do better, and we need to, be accountable, and we have, and it's a bunch of, quite, sort of maybe middle-aged therapists, maybe boomer-age therapists and whatnot. And then a few, up and coming kind of folks from, more culturally diverse communities. But the whole, initial proposal was more around the idea of, we need to do some trainings, and we need to offer more scholarships, or we need to, be more welcoming, to people of color. But I'm like, well, and my question was, how about you start with interrogating whiteness?
Yeah. And what makes you think that people of color want to be there.
Yeah,
Besides,
when the ones that
you
are
know,
there are telling you that they've continued to experience microaggressions and that there's no systems of accountability and things like
mhm,
that. And
mhm.
so, I mean, I work privately a lot, clinically, one-on-one with a lot of BIPOC folks, and I do a lot of anti-racism work like this show for white folks to try to call in. But where I sit next to people in a one-on-one setting is often like, I'm not trying to convince white clients to become anti-racist in a clinical setting like you are in that way. I mean, I know you're not like convincing them, but but maybe you are. I
Well,
don't know.
but that is but that's a goal,
Yeah,
you know?
well, I'm saying I don't want to put words in your mouth, but outward facing, I can teach that way, right? But like
Mhm,
one-on-one, like I'm just like, I don't want to deal with this. I
mhm,
want to just, do
mhm.
you understand what I'm trying to say? Like to your point about creating my own, like I want to support the people who are needing support. And I feel like a lot of Black therapists want to work with Black clients because they're like, I don't want to deal with white people. And then white people and white clinicians get mad that, you don't want to be more, you don't want to teach me, you know, you don't want to, you don't want to be more open to me, to my learning.
Well, right. And I think that it is like a real quandary because like when all the power is held by one group, by, white people, that and those people, that group holds sort of the keys to the kingdom, then it isn't enough, then by saying like we're going to create alternative structures, but just it's over time, I think it will undermine the larger structure. But for the time being, the structure is going to exist. I mean, sort of like what do you do about the prison industrial complex? Like you can't just let it. Like at the point of abolition is to kind of get rid of these structures and create something else. So I think that yes, demanding more. And I think if the Black Lives Matter movement has shown anything very powerfully, it's that like these kind of demands backed up with real muscle and real organizing have a big effect.
Okay, so what
And
happens
so,
when you're like at my internship and I'm the only woman of color there? And I'm trying to highlight certain things and I'm saying certain things, but my whole career is riding on this. How much am I going to say? How much am I going to bite my tongue about?
well, I think one thing that I see a lot of women of color and people of color doing now is demanding more from their white allies around them. And I think that's one place that I certainly kind of feel that there needs to be a lot more accountability. And that's like sort of the work that I've been doing in the mental health field, is to say, like, if you really believe in any kind of equity, that as you seem to, like raising the cognitive dissonance for people. But I think when you're the only person of color in an environment, it just isn't fair. It isn't fair, and it also isn't psychologically healthy for you to have to take that work on. And so I think it's hard for me to know exactly what to say to you as a woman of color in that situation, because I think that's a very individual or sort of like personal decision. But I think if you really truly are alone in an environment that feels unsafe, in my personal experience, just outside of racial inequity, I would say like you need to do what you can to get to safety.
No, I
So,
appreciate that. It's that idea of how do we take the actual administrators and people in charge, and how do we be able to open up to their opportunity to learning and using this as a calling in to change and modify, as opposed to
mhm,
the comfort of privilege, which is I don't really have to, right? Like I can dismiss you, this one person who's the fly in my ointment,
absolutely.
versus like I've done this for decades this way and I don't really have to. Yes, okay, I'm sorry you're having a hard time. Have a cup of tea or something. Again, our topic for today is Beyond Inclusion: How Psychotherapy Training Recreates White Supremacy and What to Do About It. Beyond Inclusion. We're taking your
Mhm.
questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Send them to us as we go along here. Raise your hand or whatever you're doing on Zoom or on Facebook or on YouTube or Twitter. And all of that. Beyond inclusion, because I think sometimes with these models, with these trainings, and even with these, like universities that, sort of press out PhDs and social workers and mental health counselors, they figure if they have a certain number, like 20% of minorities or 20% of people of color or whatever in our attendance or in our graduation rate or whatever, then that means we're doing something right. But or even in a model, for example, I was talking to a trauma model founder the other day that I was interviewing for my Rerooted podcast, and he was saying, well, we did a cohort for all Black people. And I'm like, well, that's good, but that's not everything.
Well, and I think that, I think what you're getting at in general is that there need to be more specific demands. And maybe that is something that kind of can come out of this moment and the work that we're doing and the work that that we're doing together, and then individually, like what would an alternative structure look like? Or what would even an alternative structure within, a kind of more conventional training situation, like like you did social work training, I did clinical psychology training. We were talking about how different it is in terms of like even the number of BIPOC people in the room, right? Because there's a difference if you've got sort of like 40%, 50%, 30% BIPOC people versus 10% or 5%. There's a difference in the degree of safety that people might feel. It's still a struggle. You're still dealing with a lot of the same white resistance. And the white resistance is sort of where I see myself working around, like making therapy not a place to hide from that anymore, like a place that white therapists need to challenge, white clients need to challenge each other. But in terms of like how to make these environments safer, I think numbers do matter, because at this point, what I've heard for people going through training now in clinical psychology programs is that actually it's gotten safer to talk about more difficult topics around racism, white supremacy, sexuality, like all of these things, all of these isms that in the past have kind of really been not safe to talk about, or where there's been tremendous hostility when these subjects are raised. It's gotten easier because the numbers are higher and the education level of white allies has gotten higher. Mm-hmm. And so I think numbers matter, and the kind of ongoing education of white allies matters. Mm-hmm. So I think like in the past, maybe what would be considered high enough number of a class coming in a clinical psychology program of, Black or brown students would be like 5%. And again, when we say Black or brown, we really have to focus on the numbers specifically. Brian and I were talking before the show about this chart that I pulled up from an APA publication about diversity in the clinical psychology field. And so psychology graduate students, it's still not safe for that Black student or the Black student and the one Indigenous student every couple years to be like, look, we need to talk about systemic racism and imperialism and the history of colonialism and how all of that infiltrates mental health and that's the system that we're in right now.
So what's the leverage? Because in my relational life therapy training, we talk about narcissism and grandiosity, and that the only way to move somebody who might be a blatant narcissistic husband, for example, I'm very generalizing here, but it could be anyone, that there's got to be something that matters to them that's going to be the motivator or the leverage that the latent, the sort of one down position person in the relationship, that you can tap into in order to pull down this grandiosity and sort of make space for a rising, empowerment. Now, what's the leverage for this avoidant, narcissistic, white supremacist clinical culture? What's the leverage? What's in it for them? What do they care so much about? Whoever they are, right? The university deans, the analytic training program president office, whatever people, these people who are centered in their power, doing good work as white, caring, concerned, potentially, possibly liberal or progressive thinking kind of folks, right? But what's the leverage? Because it's comfortable to stay where you are. there's inertia there. And it's nice to have good intentions, but if you're not actually doing anything differently, internally or externally, then you got nothing.
Well, I think that movements have leverage, and I think that the BLM movement has showed once again that when you create an alternative structure that has a kind of a compelling narrative behind it, and that is allied with a sort of objective truth, or a kind of like a truth that has a real that just like has like a charge to it, that people can look at it and feel it in their bones.
So they're appealing to your moral center. Janet Helms talked about that.
Yeah.
The reclaiming of sort of the moral center, or the ethical center of what it means to be human, especially when certain populations of folks like Black Americans literally were dehumanized for centuries.
Right. Like you're tapping into a moral center. You're tapping into what people can see with their own eyes. And that has its own kind of leverage. However, it does need to have numbers behind it. And so I think that that's why I sort of think of moving to alternative structures. And that's a way to kind of like put the energy into something that has like a kind of a narrative force to it.
So concrete terms, I'm not going to pay for Fordham. I'm not going to go to this analytic training program. I'm going to go do this. I'm not going to go to your white retreat center. I'm not going to go to, I'm going to go to this other place that's run by Black people, for Black people, for example, right? Where, that's created and constructed because we see things in a way that is literally more inclusive, that is not only, that is more balanced, that's more based in equity and equality. And we're not going to, it's like, we're not going to buy, literally, we're not going to buy your product anymore. We're going to create the alternate, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think that, like I came out of the punk scene in DC, and there was a lot around like not participating in the sort of mass culture and creating your own structures, your own record label, your own this, that, your own place to play music, blah, blah, blah. And I think that like, it is a really interesting model. I think in terms of training and licensing, one way to think about it is to begin to question the idea of like high status institutions, because there are a lot of ways to get licensed that you can actually go through the process. You can get good training. You can kind of, if like you're able to detach more. Well, for one thing, like allowing yourself to let go of the idea of like needing to be called doctor, letting go of the idea of like needing, when people are beginning to contemplate training, like feeling like that you're going to be getting less if you don't become a medical doctor, you don't become a clinical psychologist. I mean, looking back on it now, I don't know if I needed to take on all the debt I needed to take on to do what I did. I did it because at the time it seemed like it made sense, and I was like very seduced by the idea of having a doctoral degree. And in some ways it made sense, but it also, but also only because I was in a position to do it at that time. But it's not necessary, like that the idea that it's necessary to have these sort of higher status degrees and access in order to do the work of helping people to heal from psychic distress is actually part of the problem.
Right. But I don't know if that's really why people do it. I had a white clinical psychologist tell me, you want to go for a 5-year PhD program because people think you're important when you have doctor in front of your name. And, I cringe at that. This is a white cis het male, therapist. And yet at the same time, I'm like, well, I'm not ready for that. I don't want to do that right now. And I'm going to go do this instead, which is fine.
But I don't know that that's true, because I think there are people out there with no degree charging the same amount. I mean, it depends again on like, it also depends on the access that you have to people who are willing to pay and not just use insurance, because we're talking about the only people who can go see people who aren't licensed or can sort of pick and choose who they want to go to, or people who don't have to use insurance or even can access mental health care outside of any kind of public system. So, like, again, like making mental health care accessible and less exclusive and less, that's like sort of a separate but very connected conversation, because part of the reason that we have such difficulty with people accessing mental health care, especially people who are poorer, is because there's so much emphasis on doctors and people with doctor in front of their name making high salaries, in addition to insurance executives making high salaries, and, you know, all the people who are parts of these systems that are making 7 figures in order to deliver, you know, healthcare for people on Medicaid.
Right, right, right.
So that's part of it. But I guess, like, just to wrap up your question, like, I think it's telling that it was a white cishet male that told you that, because he's probably the one who's not going to take you seriously if you don't have doctor in front of your name. But there's probably a lot of other people who are who don't have as much privilege as he does, who would be perfectly happy to get high quality care from someone, regardless of if they have doctor in front of their name. And it's only people who are super invested in these systems of privilege that use these markers of privilege to figure out who can give them quality care.
Yeah, I think it's a good note, and I don't know how much we unpacked about the, you know, like, it's just a big thing, right? Like, yes, institutionalized racism within these teaching academic institutions and whatnot is a problem. How we deal with it is going to be an evolution. I think what I heard you say is essentially that, you know, these movements can be leveraged. These social times of Black Lives Matter and the protests can be some of the leverage to help appeal to the hearts and minds of those within institutions that are centered in seats of power, to actually really interrogate and look at what and how the training is structured, and really also, you know, circle back to the ethical mandates that are cooked into all of these licensures, and really apply the lens of racism and anti-racist action in a very real and embodied way, and triple check on that. And then wherever there are places where there are holes, should start to get to work on that right now.
Right. And I think that for white-bodied people and people who are positions of privilege within these systems, like, it's not enough for us to rely on grassroots movements. We have to create our own movements and our own leverage within these systems. And we do need to work collectively in order to do that.
No man is an island, or woman, or them, or Z, or there, or anyone. So, all right, folks, we're going to have to leave it here for today. That's our show, Inside Out, with Dr. Natasha Stovall and me, Francesca Maximé. And just want to remind everyone that today at 3:30, I'll be doing a anti-racism for white-bodied folks process group. If you want to join me in just a couple of hours, folks can come in. It's anti-racism. I can't even really remember it. Responsibility, embodiment, accountability, and action. And that's just a group that you can come to if you want to sort of continue this kind of a conversation, but experientially sort of come up against some of the ways in which we have these implicit biases and beliefs. And once those subcortical shifts start happening internally, I think that it's actually a lot easier to show up externally in ways that are the ways in which you and I are talking about. So any last thoughts from you, Dr. Stovall?
Well, Francesca, Dr. Maximé, I can just call you doctor because you are like a doctor to me. And I can sort of, maybe that's part of what we're talking about, is like choosing who you give the honorific doctor to in your life, rather than allowing that to be dictated to you. But, you know, I think that part of, I think, what's so draining about talking about institutions is maybe, you know, kind of illustrates what about institutions is in and of itself draining for individuals and for people. And that there is something about having institutions that that there's like kind of a desire for, but also like that maybe it doesn't serve us as like sort of humanity in terms of, you know, creating a more equitable society where everyone is valued, everyone is sort of met according to where they are and like their abilities, and, you know, allowed to contribute and, you know, live as in a way that kind of makes sense for them and the collective.
Yeah, being authentic and having that be safe.
Yeah, and maybe like in, you know, sort of in terms of what we're suggesting, you know, maybe this is just a starting point in terms of like having a conversation about what is going on in the present, but that we need to have more conversations about and continue this exploration of like, what can be done in individual situations, like the ones you're describing of like, the clinical psychology cohort with one Black student and one Indigenous student and the rest white, and how to address that individual situation versus like sort of these more theoretical conversations about, the overall problem.
Right. Well, we got to start somewhere. So we're starting here, and we're also going to dig back and, inviting everybody to look at everything from the inside out. Take your time, do your reading. Most of the folks that say, once you start to see this, you can't unsee it and it becomes your life's work. And I certainly say that about what's happened with me. It's not something you do. It's a part of who you're becoming. And we invite you to take the journey with us. I'm going to leave it here for now. We're out of time. Thank you to Brian Wesley Johnson, our fearless producer, So Liberty Live. Yay. And to Natasha, and to all of our viewers and listeners. Ping us if you have any more questions. We'll see you again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Take it easy.
Thank you, Francesca.